The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good evening and welcome to this evening's webinar. Hello, I'm Marc Jones and I'll be part facilitator and part presenter for tonight's webinar. We also have Katie Foley from AHDB who will be in the background making sure everything is running smoothly. On the right hand side, hopefully you'll find the questions tab and button. Feel free to type questions into that panel box throughout. Jim will be talking for about 40 minutes and we will ask the questions towards the end, but again, feel free to put those questions up as we're going along and hopefully I'll read the list out towards the end. These series of webinars have been jointly sponsored by AHDB, Field Options, Vermont and KWS. Field Options is a grass and forage forage-based seed specialist and have been developing beet grazing systems in the UK for 17 years and currently have 4 grazing varieties. Vermont is based in northeast France and the breeders of dual-purpose fodder beet. KWS are a major breeder of sugar and fodder beet in Europe and are improving crop establishment through high-tech seed production. So finally, tonight we'll be talking about fodder beet grazing systems for beef cattle. This is actually the second in a series of 5 webinars. The first was transition of cattle and sheep to fodder beet, and this actually took place about a fortnight ago and will be available shortly on the AHDB website for you to look at if you need to in the future. The third webinar will be on dairy, and this will be on the 27th of October. We'll have one on sheep on the 2nd of November, and finally one on agronomy on the 9th of November. This series will also be run in Wales in the next couple of weeks as well, so if you do miss out, feel free to join with Farm Connect in Wales. So moving on, our speakers tonight are firstly Rhys Owen from Field Options. So Rhys specialises in the agronomy of grassland, forage crops and fodder beet and is basis and facts trained. There's myself, Marc Jones, I'm an independent grass and forage consultant. I work for farmers converting over to forage systems and outwintering. I also farm and outwinter around 350 dairy beef on fodder beet each year. And finally, our main speaker is Dr Jim Gibbs. So Jim is a research scientist in ruminant nutrition at Lincoln University in New Zealand. He is also a trained veterinarian. And over the last 10 years, much of his research has concentrated on fodder beet. He has been the main driver increasing grazed beet from 10 hectares to 70,000 hectares over a 10-year period in New Zealand. So after concluding that, I'd now like to pass over to Jim. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Marc, for the introduction, and welcome to all the listeners to this webinar series. As Marc said, we're going to be talking about beef cattle grazing systems using fodder beet this evening. And we're going to, first of all, have a short series on where fodder beet fits into the pasture-fed beef industry. So looking at the seasonal intervention using fodder beet crops in the pasture-fed beef industry in particular. And then we're going to address specifically the young stock finishing, so the weaner finishing systems using both fodder beet and then following that with pasture, and also the adult finishing systems for the older cattle, which are exclusively on crop. And then Marc will speak on the use of fodder beet in Suckler cow systems. And that will include the use of beet out on pasture. We'll look after that at some of the troubleshooting for beef systems using beet and specifically address some of the myths that are prevalent around the use of beet in beef systems before we take questions. So we'll start first and foremost on looking at the pasture-fed systems. And will be no news to any of the listeners that in recent years there's been an increased interest in certain demographics of the use of animals that are raised on forages alone And in most cases, this tends to be animals that are raised without grain. Now, whether that's a good thing or not is slightly to one side. The fact is that there's a strong consumer preference in certain demographics for these animals that are only raised in forage systems. And usually there's a cluster of things that are reported whenever people are assessed on this. And the idea is that this is a natural product, first and foremost. And certainly there seems to be a very positive recognition that animal welfare and the environmental footprint of these systems is improved when we're talking about pasture-based systems rather than some systems that have fed grain. And historically, that has been particularly the North American feedlot systems. So there's a market advantage in some ways in some of these pasture-fed systems. From an on-farm perspective, pasture-fed systems as a general rule offer much lower input costs, and they also take control of feed supply back onto farm. I mean, if the feed base is being produced on the farm, then you're not at the mercy of forward contracts or any other perturbations in that supply chain. So there's a number of advantages that have pushed along pasture-fed systems and a greater interest in forage systems in general. The difficulty, though, is that pasture-fed systems, by their very nature, are dependent on the climate and the season. And so the practical reality of this is that in certain seasons, in temperate environments in particular, there's a feed deficit. There's a great change in the quality and the quantity of feed that's grown, and all of the listeners will be familiar with this. So if we look at the two photographs to the right-hand side of the screen, there's several times of the year where it's either too cold to grow or it's too dry to grow. And in both of those cases, it means that the feed supply is reduced. Now, there's two practical realities that arise from this, which have been encountered in every country that has a significant component of pasture-fed beef production. And the first is to do with the processors, who find the continuity of supply tricky when they've got a seasonal surplus and a seasonal deficit. And a lot of the contracts are dependent on a consistent monthly supply. And so there are some difficulties there in pasture-fed systems alone. And the second one is that in most cases, the total annual diet quality is reduced compared to, say, a feedlot system. And that in certain seasons, the pasture quality is about equivalent, but in other seasons, it isn't. And the net effect of this is that these animals are older when they approach their slaughter time. Now, there's a few things that have been consistently demonstrated in the literature, and again, particularly the North American literature, but also the European literature. And in general terms, for the same carcass weight, it's an older carcass. Now, that doesn't automatically impact on eating quality, but what it does often bring in is a variability. And as a consequence, again, from a marketing perspective, sometimes that can be more difficult. People aren't sure for the same age what food quality is going to be in front of them. The other demonstrated realities are that in most cases, the pasture-fed carcasses tend to be a lower live weight compared to the feedlot-fed carcasses. And on top of that, they typically have a lower fat content, both in intramuscular fat or marbling and in fat cover. Now, again, they can be subject to consumer preferences, and they also, that fat cover and intramuscular fat in particular does affect taste. So there are some other issues with pasture-fed systems and the beef that's produced on them. And I'll add a small section at the end to say that there are more and more studies coming out showing that longer time to slaughter means that the resource use is a lot greater in those systems. Now, that's in general terms. So feed used above maintenance, for example, water requirements. There's a whole series of things that are demonstrated quite logically that if they're alive longer, they use more of them for the same kilograms of carcass. But some of the more recent work and some of the work that I'm involved in has also demonstrated that on a single kilogram of carcass weight, they can also be responsible for a higher methane emission profile and also nitrogen excretion profile, again, per kilogram carcass weight. So there's some other reasons why those seasonal feed deficits can be a problem, and this is where beet can fit very neatly into the beef production system and really where it has fitted into this in New Zealand. Now, to look at this in a plain manner, if we're looking at the axis on the left-hand side as live weight gains, and we're just looking through from a spring-born animal. Well, while it's still on the cow, the live weight gain per day tends to remain up there. And so we put a notional figure there of around 1 kilo a day. And if we look at a 180 or 200 day weaning period, then that live weight gain will be maintained there or thereabouts across that period. But in the typical instance after that, the live weight gain will be reduced. And depending on the winter approach, if it's poorer quality feed or restricted feed, then the live weight gain will be significantly reduced as we move through that winter. It'll rise again in spring, decline again in the next autumn, often goes down further again into the second winter. And it's after the third spring where they've made carcass weight targets by live weight targets. And of course, in Britain, the 30 months comes into play. If we looked at the New Zealand scenario, the average carcass is produced by some of the large processors at between 26 and 36 months of age. So they've gone through the process that we've seen in front of us. Now, if that's to be changed, then what has to happen is that later autumn, winter, and early part of spring has to be altered. And where beet can fit into the system, and what we'll discuss tonight is exactly that. And if that is provided, the right amount of feed and a high quality feed, then those live weight gains can be maintained or even increased. The spring flush can be taken advantage of, and it's possible to produce a 300 kilo carcass at that 14 to 16 month bracket. The other place where beet can fit into the system for beef production is moving specifically towards improving the carcass in those older animals by improving the fat content, and particularly intramuscular marbling and fat cover. And one way that that can be done is that beet can be used effectively as a green feedlot in that latter part of the animal's life in the 70 or 100 days prior to slaughter at around 26 months old. And it's a similar live weight target, a similar 300 or beyond 300 kilogram carcass weight target to do so. And what it's effectively doing is, again, making the most of an autumn and winter where the live weight gains can be significantly increased to do so. So with that as a background, we'll look specifically at these systems. Now, for the listeners who didn't hear the last webinar, we spent a little bit of time talking on beet, and I'd refer you back to that. But there's a component here that's important for the beef grazing systems that we have to reiterate. And the first one is that as a plant, fodder beet has a bulb that can be 50% sucrose. So it's a high energy plant with a very high metabolizable energy and a significant load of very rapidly fermentable carbohydrate. Now, the bulb has relatively low protein, and in a balanced diet, it has to be matched by the protein and the minerals that are present in the leaf. That means for these grazing systems to be effective, there has to be specific agronomy that produces a leafy crop. Now, it's just worth noting, we'll mention a couple of times, that this is very different from sugar beet agronomy. So grazing fodder beet agronomy is a rapidly developing field over the last decade or so that's set to produce these rather different crops. And so the example we can see in front of us, approximately 20 to 25% of the total dry matter of the plant will be in the leaf, and the remainder will be in the bulb. And we strip graze them because we have to match the supply of that leaf with the bulb at the same time that we're maximising their diet. Now, that high carbohydrate presents some transition issues, which were the subject of the last webinar, and we're going to discuss that transition, particularly with young stock and adult finishing today in beef. Now, the overview of all of these diets, for perhaps the listeners who aren't familiar with them, is that they're strip grazed in a paddock, and the fodder beet is the primary diet. And by primary, we typically mean 90% or so of the total diet. Now, for good production, there has to be another component to that diet that provides a roughage and in some cases a protein source. But when we say roughage, we need to be really clear. There's no automatic requirement for a hard fibre. So in the beef production in particular, there's no advantage in feeding straw. In fact, we usually have no straw in the system for the reason that it will reduce intakes and reduce live weight gain. So when we're talking about that roughage, it's important to note that it can be, in fact, best practice is, it can be stripped grazed pasture with no other inputs. So the diet in that case would be 90% odd beef with 10% stripped grazed pasture. Now, in short of that pasture being available, then certainly silages and hay can be used. There are some issues with access, which we'll discuss particularly. So we'll start with the first of these systems, which is the Weaner finishing system, commonly known in New Zealand as the Fisher system. And we developed this system on Silverstream Charolais belonging to Bruce and Brent Fisher, and it's still in operation today. Now, this system goes back to our pressure points in the forage fed cycle. And if we take those weaned animals in autumn, so in the case of New Zealand, they're overwhelmingly spring-born. That isn't always the case in the UK, but in New Zealand, they're overwhelmingly spring-born, and then they're weaned in autumn. Now, if we take those weaners at 270 kilograms live weight or above, now again, that's a approximate weaning time of 180 to 200 days, then we put them on the beet, and we'll discuss how in a moment, for 130 or 150 days from that autumn period right through late autumn, through winter, and into the early part of spring. We keep them going until there's adequate grass for them. As a general rule of thumb, our live weight gains across that period mean that we're the other side of 400 kilograms of live weight by the time there's surplus and ample grass in spring to release them onto. And then we use that full pasture intake to take them to finishing weights over approximately 90 days. Now, specifically, the way that this system is operated is that these weaners have often had no background at all with hot wires, and because we're strict grazing it, they have to have. So the practical reality is that we would gather them in fairly large numbers. Mob sizes can be up to 500. It would be quite uncommon to have mob sizes under 100 or so. And so they can be done in fairly large numbers and at scale. And they'd be put out on good quality grass and trained to the hot wire. Now, that good quality grass is important, particularly if those animals have come from an environment which isn't uncommon in earlier autumn, where the quality of feed might have been quite low. So the milk supply from the cow had been declining over that later period, and the feed quality wasn't particularly high. So that 3 odd weeks is what we would routinely do, where those animals have access to good quality feed. Now, part of this is adapting the rumen to higher quality feed and higher energy transfer from the diet over that period. The other component is getting them used to being behind a hot wire and being handled closely, which is an important requirement in the beet grazing systems. This system also involves, in most cases, beet being put out to them on the pasture. Now, this is because young stock, as we'll see a little later, are reasonably fussy and quite slow to get onto eating beet bulbs. They're much slower than the older animals. So they have to learn that the bulbs can be eaten whole, and they have to learn that the bulbs are palatable and good feed. So in that period where they're out on the grass, what is very common is that some of the beet is lifted with a beet bucket and it's put out to them on that grass, smashed up with a tractor wheel usually, and it's a very small amount, but it encourages a lot of them to begin trying beet before the transition process is done. Now, in some cases, that transition process will include this, where there's more and more beet being put out to them, and that is possible to do. We also, at this stage, would make sure that they're vaccinated against clostridial diseases. This is a really important component in young stock. Older animals are less susceptible. The adult finishing animals are not especially susceptible to clostridial diseases, and the wintering dairy cows, as we'll see in subsequent webinars, hardly at all. But the young animals are particularly sensitive to Clostridium perfringens type D, one of the very straightforward clostridial diseases that's vaccinated against with the 5-in-1, for example. So they would all receive their full course of 2 vaccinations approximately a month apart prior to going onto that crop. We would also drench them for whatever residual worm burden there would be, and make sure that the system that they're in, the trace element requirements for that system are met. So that varies in different regions. Some soils have different trace element deficiencies, and in most cases, when we're talking about trace elements, we're particularly talking about selenium and copper. In other cases, it's also including cobalt and iodine. Now, it's worth pointing out here that in the winter, these animals will drink next to nothing. So it's not an effective system to put any of their supply in the water. That's very commonly done in other parts of the annual season in New Zealand, but it's not effective at all to put that trace element supply in their water in winter. For a good number of these animals after transition, if they're on maximum intakes as we want them to be, they won't drink a mouthful across the whole of the winter. They're wildly overhydrated by the amount of water that they're eating in the beet. It's also not effective to use mineral blocks that are out in the paddock on free choice or voluntary operation. It's been demonstrated repeatedly that the best of these, when animals have been artificially induced into trace element deficiencies, the best of these systems will supply about 80% of the mob. In other words, 20% won't go near them even in those environments. It's much more likely to be 50% in ordinary cases. So we would inject them rather than have a block supply or a water supply at this time. So these animals, once they're trained and once they've had an opportunity to see the beet, would then be transitioned onto the crop until they're achieving unrestricted beet intakes. And we'll talk a little more later about what that looks like in practice. But to do it, what would happen is that we would start them at about 0.5 kilogram of dry matter a day of beet. Now, in the previous webinar, we talked about good transition protocols. Suffice to say here that if these animals are going to be transitioned well, then they have to be fully fed through this transition period. If they're not fully fed, they put more pressure on the lines, they eat in a different pattern out of a greater appetite cycle in the day, and they make trouble for you. So we have to restrict the beet on the account of adapting the rumen and the animal and their intake behaviour to the very high carbohydrate load of the beet. So we have to significantly restrict that beet and adapt them onto it, transition slowly up to higher intakes. At the same time, we have to keep them fully fed. So it's really important post-transition that they're on a restricted supplement intake. But in the early part of transition, they have to be given enough non-beet in the diet to make sure that they're at full intakes. So that typically would be, depending on the size of the weaner, somewhere between 3 and 4 kilograms of pasture or good quality silage. Now, it's really important that attention's paid at this time, and their daily appetite cycle is used to your advantage. So they're relatively fussy animals, and you have to be careful. If you're feeding them the supplement or the pasture before they go onto the beet, you'll have a hard time getting a lot of animals onto that beet. So if you're using that appetite cycle for you, you should put them onto the beet, the proper dry matter allocation of that beet behind a hot wire. Put them on in the time of day when they're hungriest. Now, in the early stages, 0.5 kilogram of beet doesn't take them that long to eat. So it's important that you have the issues that we spoke about in the last webinar around access and space. But it doesn't typically take very long for them to eat that amount of beet. It does take them a while to get all of the group onto eating that amount of beet. And then after that, the supplement can be fed in the daily cycle. Now, once all of the animals are eating bulb, and in the weaner systems, that commonly means that the first introductory ration of about 0.5 kilo and 3 or 4 kilos of other in the diet will often be kept for a week. So they're quite slow, and it's very common to have 25 or 30% that aren't onto the beet. So usually they're much slower than the older animals, but once they are onto it and they're eating bulb, at that point the beet in the diet can be raised, and it's raised about 0.5 kilo every second day until they're unrestricted beet intake. So they're leaving beet bulb behind every day. So that process would continue, and it will be at least 14 days. Commonly in these, it's 3 weeks. They then stay on this crop at these maximum intakes with minimum and restricted supplement for somewhere between 130 and 150 days, right through the late autumn, right through the winter, and until there's ample spring grass available. That's an important point for this system. It can't be restricted spring grass. It has to be ample spring grass. So when they leave the beet system, they're also on unrestricted intakes of spring grass. And then we would use that really good quality and very available spring grass entirely as their diet for approximately 90 days. And then they're at live weight targets for 300 kilogram plus pasture. Now, I'll just note one thing there. There's some very poor information that's available in different places, and you commonly hear that there's a transition onto the beet crop and there's a transition off the beet crop. That's completely false. I want to be very plain on this one. There is no transition off the crop. What we would typically do is feed them on beet just as we would before. So they would have started at something in their 270 or 300 kilogram weaners would have started at that weight on as post-transition on as much beet as they could eat, which at that point will be about 2.2% of their intake. So if we were to take a 300 kilogram animal, its unrestricted intake is still under 7 kilos of beet in terms of dry matter a day, and they'd have 1 kilogram of the grass if we can, or a really good quality supplement after it. Now at the end, they might be well over 400 kilos, and 150 days later, they're still on 1 kilo of supplement only. So the supplement doesn't move across that system, and the beet increases the whole time. So they're always on unrestricted feed intakes. And at the end of that period, when the beet is complete, we open the gate and put them directly onto the pasture. There is no transition at all back onto that pasture diet. And typically their intakes and their live weight gain will go up in that, automatically go up in that spring period with no delay. The special requirements for this system compared to the older animals are, and probably in the order, the vaccination against Clostridial disease. This is the priority health issue. It's uncommon to have transition clinical acidosis. There's other issues that you run into if you've transitioned them poorly. The main one of them being feed aversion. If you transition them poorly, then if they eat too much too soon, then they learn that beet is not good for them to eat a lot of, and they will learn that lesson for the whole season, and you won't get them back. But and you typically have very poor live weight gains in those cases. But it's not common in young stock, particularly, to have clinical acidosis. You don't see that very commonly, and as a contribution to the deaths on crop, it's absolutely negligible. However, Clostridial deaths, if they're not vaccinated properly and they're at full intakes and they're feeding well, are a much more significant issue. So that vaccination is very important before they're going on. When you're able to see Clostridial deaths, you normally won't see them till about 3 weeks into the program. You don't see them initially, you see them when they're achieving higher and higher intakes. Now, the second one is that they are a lot fussier, and so both the agronomic quality of the crop and the cultivar of the crop become more important. They require a greater leaf, a greater quality leaf, and there's different cultivars have different palatability of the bulb. So there are some cultivars that just aren't suitable for young animals, and there's other cultivars that are really positive for younger animals. As you move to older animals and then to dairy cows, that palatability becomes less and less of an issue. Dairy cows really aren't fussy at all, and the rising 2-year-old steers and heifers are somewhere in between. So there's an important component of that crop. If they have a poorly grown crop and there's no leaf, it's very difficult to return that. And note that we've said that there's a higher protein requirement for these younger animals compared to the older animals. And that protein requirement can be partially fed in these crops by increasing the amount of leaf and the protein in the bulb. The supplement we will talk about in troubleshooting later, but note that we've said here that it's very important that supplement's restricted to 1 kilogram of dry matter a day. That's a principal problem where it goes wrong, and you have to be quite careful. Even an extra kilo or 2 of that will rapidly decrease the amount of beet that's eaten, and as a consequence, your live weight gains will suffer. That supplement has to be relatively high protein, so it can't be straw, for example, or poor quality hay. It has to be at least the crude protein of the crop or above. And it's better if it's a greener, so that's why pasture is always best. It's better if it's got that green material in them, because apart from the protein, some of the fat-soluble vitamins are also a positive in terms of intake for these young animals. Our preference is always to have, wherever possible, strip grazed pasture. After that, the next step would be silages. Important to note, and we spent quite some time on this in the previous webinar, that if you're putting silage out, it's not only being allocated very carefully on that 1 kilogram, but also the system that you're using to distribute it should mean that they all have equal access. So to put that in real terms, if I've got a 200 kilo dry matter medium round silage bale in plastic, then potentially I've got feed for 200 animals in a mob. in one bale feeder. And everyone can appreciate that they're not going to all line up carefully and eat 1 kilo each and leave. Some will get 3 times, 4 times what they need and not eat any beet. A lot will get absolutely nothing, and there'll be some in the middle who might get it right. So you have to be quite careful in the way that that supplement is supplied. And again, that's a common problem. Now, timing is the other one. They are really slow to learn, and so the transition is usually extended by at least a week in the early stages. Now we're going to talk about the adult finishing systems, and they share some of the characteristics of the weaner systems, but there's some profound differences as well. So as an outline, these are often 18-month-old animals. In the New Zealand case, again, almost all spring-born, and at this stage, they're in their second autumn. If we look at the steers, our preference is for about 440 kilos. They can be used down to 400 kilos, but our preference is for sort of 440 kilo live weight steers. They're taken from mid-autumn, and they're taken through that mid-autumn and winter, and they're slaughtered directly off the crop. So there's no grass involved in this system except maybe they're co-grazing pasture while they're on the crop, but they don't have a period after that where they're on pastures. So they're brought in, they're kept on the crop for that period. Their live weight gains are typically high, so our base level to begin with is about 1.3 kilograms of live weight gain a day, and that would give us a target carcass weight of 300 kilos at about a 550 or 530 kilogram live weight, and commensurately increase after that. I should note there that for the listeners that the standard yield of beet is higher than it is of pasture. So if we look across our large processes with hundreds of thousands of examples of this, our typical pasture yield for the carcass expressed against their live weight is about 52%. The yield of beet begins at about 56%. And for the British breeds in particular, for Angus and Herefords, at about a 56 or slightly over 56%. And for some of the European breeds can be 58% or above. So our 530 kilos is about our 300 kilogram carcass. And the rationale for these systems is that they're pitched to provide really good quality beef at a time of year where on forage-based systems it can be quite difficult to do so. And that's in that winter period and the early spring. And the beef schedule is often higher for prices in New Zealand at that time, and that's where this market has been developed for. So the practical bones of this system is that they're brought in, they're trucked into these places, and they're put into their groups, and then they're transitioned directly. So they don't have the prelim warm-up that the younger animals have. It's assumed that they've had more experience with hot wires, for example, and they're transitioned directly once they're arriving on the farm. Now, the practical reality of that is it's very efficient in terms of land use. You're not having larger areas where you have to keep very large numbers of stock. They start at between 1 and 2 kilograms of dry matter of beet is their introductory diet, and that means, for the same reasons we discussed with the weaner, that they have to have other parts of their diet to keep them fully fed, so they're not putting pressure on the lines, and they're in positive live weight gain territory right throughout transition. And their appetite cycle comes into play, not as strongly, and it's not as great a requirement as it is with the weaners. But in most cases, to begin with, we would also put them on the beet when they're hungry, and so they're allocated the correct dry matter, and then they're put onto that beet when they're hungry in the early stages, and that ration is not increased until we're confident that all the animals in the mob are eating that bulb. So note again, not the leaf. Most animals will eat the leaf. With no training at all, will eat the leaf. It's making sure that all the animals are consuming the amount of bulb before that begins to be increased. Now that is usually much shorter time. It can be down to a couple of days in many cases. And after that's achieved, then it's an increase of 1 kilogram of dry matter every second day. And then that's increased steadily and without pause until they achieve unrestricted intakes. And that will be the other side of 14 days. What would happen practically in most cases is in the first week, they have 7 kilograms of something other than beet in their diet. In the second week, that would normally fall to 3 to 4. And then the third week thereafter, we were looking to have them consume 2 kilograms. So that would often mean, if we took it as an average, that they're allocated 2.5 kilograms in some weather conditions or in some grazing conditions, they might need to be allocated more to achieve that 2 kilograms consumed. So again, there's a sweet spot with that supplement supply in their diet. If they're given less than that, then they'll eat less beet and they'll have lower live weight gains. If they're given more than that, you'll dramatically and quickly reduce their live weight gains. So just one thing to note there, giving them unrestricted access to lots of supplement and bale feeders, for example, is a sure way to reduce your profit in these systems. If you give it to them, they'll eat it. It's easier for them to eat that silage than it is for them to chip away at eating the beet, and they'll eat it. And as a consequence of that, your beet intakes will be reduced, your live weight gain and your profit will be reduced. So it's, again, a highly restricted amount of supplement that we're using in these systems. It should be noted that for various technical reasons around the supply of very high levels of sugar in their diet, that these animals lay down a lot of fat very quickly. Typically in the first 30 days or so of this program, the live weight gains are steady, but thereafter the live weight gains are exaggerated, and particularly the deposition of fat. So fat in the brisket and intramuscular fat similarly. So this is often spoken about as a premature fatness compared to some other pasture-fed and forage-fed systems. Now, the other important component of this is that these animals are slaughtered directly off the crop. So they're drafted on the crop as they're finishing and they're slaughtered directly off that crop. If we were to look at the advantages and the limitations of these different systems, well, the Weaner systems, from an industry point of view, they're very efficient because they annualise the system, so they can be effectively produced in not too far over a year. And they're a relatively low resource use in terms of the amount of feed that they've consumed for the same weight of carcass, or the amount of nitrogen or water, etc., that they're consumed. And so there's some positives there. The other positives are that this system can work with the stocking rate on farm. So in most cases, there's always going to be a large amount of feed and good quality feed in spring. And the difficulty is maintaining the stocking rate on farm to make the most of that spring feed. And what this system does is use the dry matter that's grown in spring and summer in the warmer seasons. It's banked and it's kept as a very high dry matter feed into that winter system. As a consequence, the animals can make the most of that and they can keep those live weight gains really high. They come out the other end as a large framed up animal with a much higher intake and the capacity to have a higher live weight gain in spring than they would if they'd been on survival mode, which wasn't uncommon in previous brassica systems, for example, in winter feeding. And that means that they can achieve those target weights at the end of spring before the grass dries off and begins to disappear again. Because these animals are younger, as a general rule, their carcasses are positive. The limitation with younger carcasses historically on pasture-fed systems was a lack of fat cover. That's not a problem with beet. There's a very high intramuscular marbling even in the very young carcasses, and as a consequence, they're elite. They're younger, they're tender, there's less ossification, and they're elite carcasses. To pick some of the processes in New Zealand with very large sample numbers to go on, the category 1, so the highest category of carcass quality that's judged in the processing plants. If we looked at the pasture-fed animals in general, about 40% of all animals will make that carcass grade. If we look at the beet system, that's approximately 80%. So, and in some situations with experienced operators, it approaches 100%. So they really can produce very elite carcasses at a young age. So they're very efficient and they're working with that stocking rate to achieve a great product. Now, the other side of it is that some of the systems, it suits them not to finish them on grass on their own farm, and so they're a very effective and profitable store sale at that point when most people are looking for good cattle to buy to make use of spring grass. If we look at the adult systems, the advantage for them is that these stock come in and out only on the crop. So these systems suit very large scale. Within a short few years in New Zealand, an entire new livestock sector was developed around these, and the largest of these farms would do somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 trade steers and heifers a year. So they'd be accumulated in that period before autumn somewhere else, and then they'd be brought onto the beet grazing farms and they'd be kept on the crop. Now, in practical cases, the stocking rate is approximately 1 animal per tonne grown, slightly better than 1 animal per tonne grown. So for if we're growing a 30-tonne crop, which is reasonably common in New Zealand, 30 tonnes of dry matter a hectare, that means our stocking rate is above 30 to the hectare on that crop. So even for 3,000 odd animals, trade steers in most cases, that's going to represent only 100 hectares or so. So it's a very efficient land use system to put a high quality product directly into that high value market. Now, it is slightly different in terms of when that market price is achieved in different countries, and in the UK this is slightly different, but as a general rule of thumb for the forage fed systems, the times when they're at a deficit are in winter and early spring. Well, the advantage of the adult systems is it's putting a lot of animals of very good quality beef out there at that time. And the other component is that regardless of their background, with some reservations around that, it's a very rapid way to produce an elite carcass. So it's a system where even animals that have had a harder time in that autumn, in that 100-day period, can be turned around and have really good fat cover, really good intramuscular marbling, and a higher quality carcass than they might otherwise have achieved. So if we're just looking at troubleshooting, the two things that are preeminent with this is the amount of beef that's left behind these animals that really that shows that the system they're using genuinely is an unrestricted intake. So we'll show some photos of this in a moment and I'll explain that in more depth. But note, that's the first and foremost problem. Many people who are getting used to beef get this wrong. And it's a very difficult one to make sure that your system is getting it right, at least in the learning phase. And the second component we've talked about a bit already, which is the fact that that supplement has to be at the right amount. And that right amount also means that all animals have access to it. 200 young animals will not get around one bale feeder. They will not. So if you really want high live weight gains, you have to get that supplement right, and that will mean changing the system. Now, they're the two most important by far. So if we're looking here, you can see to the left-hand side of the photograph, to the left of the scientist, you can see that there's the next day's break. Now, if you want maximum intakes on beef, one of the peculiarities of this diet is that the beet that's behind them, so if you look on the right-hand side of the photograph, you can see that beet that's covered in mud, etc. Now, that beet was 2 days ago. Now, that beet will be steadily eaten at approximately the same rate that the beet will be eaten in the break that was 1 day behind them or the day that you're going to give them. So what this practically means is if you want maximum intakes, one of the peculiarities is you have to have, when you go to move the line the next day, you have to have 25% of the dry matter that you allocated yesterday still on the ground in front of you. And the day before that, there should be 10% of the dry matter, and the day before that, 5%. Now, beyond that 3 days, it's a billiard table, and utilisation is very high. So in the whole system, you're not wasting any beet at all. But one of the peculiarities is, unlike brassicas, Swedes in particular, you have to leave that amount of beet with 3 days on the ground if you want to achieve maximum intake. Now, 25% of the dry matter is usually a very difficult figure for farmers to be introduced to, because they feel that it's wasteful until they're used to the system and they see that it's all eaten. Even that material that's covered in mud will be eaten and eaten well. This is the primary reason why people don't achieve intakes and then live weight gain. So if we're looking at another system here, you can see that there has to be a large amount of material still on the ground. If you're getting that 25% right, you have to have a large amount of material. That's 1 in every 4 bulbs walking along as you kick them over. It's more than most people think. So here's a couple of examples of where it's gone completely wrong. So you can see behind here that in the photograph to the left, this particular operator thinks that the animal's on unrestricted intakes because if it wanted to, it could still put its mouth down and eat some of the bulbs on the ground. Now, one of the peculiarities of the beet diet is it doesn't work like that. And unless you have a large amount of that material behind, you are not on unrestricted intakes. And you can see the photograph to the right. Well, they've eaten almost everything. And if you look carefully at them, on top of that, there's a lot of leaf material that's left there, which is a sure sign that they're feeding too much supplement. Now, this is an example. If you look to the right-hand side, you can see the 24-hour break, or there's an amount of material on the ground. Note, people are looking in for the first time, they think that there's plenty there. There actually isn't plenty there. That's way too little. If you look carefully again, there's lots of green material, a sure sign that they've left too much supplement in that system. And if you look at 48 or 72 hours, there's hardly any there. And here's another couple of examples of underfeeding. Now, some other troubleshooting systems on the weaners in particular are that they're really slow, and I think we've covered that effectively. They're just slow to be introduced to their learning bulb for the first time. And they are very fussy in terms of their crop and their cultivar compared to the older stock. You have to be much more careful agronomically and with your cultivar selections around them. Upright varieties that are out the ground are preferable. If low intakes have been achieved and live weight gains have been low in that system, then one of the other things to look at is a poor transition policy, and that feed aversion that we spoke of earlier are an important component in very young animals. Once you teach them not to eat beet, you don't get them back for that season. So if you ruin that transition, then you've ruined the rest of your season, and you can't rescue that. You can start again next year and try again. Now, those animals will subsequently go onto grass and they'll grow out, so you haven't lost them, they haven't had a permanent damage, but you've put a very strong feed aversion into them over that period, and you won't change that in that season. And later we'll talk a little bit about the fact that the paddock selection and your design play a role. Of course, it plays a role in your allocation and your access, but it also plays a role in their intake. They don't like deep mud as youngsters, and they'll reduce their intakes if they're in poorly designed paddocks or in areas that are unsuitable for beet grazing. And of course, we discussed vaccinations. Now, the older ones share all of the issues with supplement and beet access, the 3 days on the ground in particular. But note, they have something else that is often responsible for poor live weight gains. And they'll similarly have the feed aversion in transition, though they're a little less susceptible to that than the younger ones. But a very important component is many of those autumn animals will have come through some hard times before being on the crop. These aren't the animals that you would automatically take because you have a very short time in that adult finishing system to get these animals right. And it can often take 30 days to turn them around. So if in the larger systems, they'd often mandate not only a live weight, but in the period 1 month before being acquired in autumn, that they were going forward rather than going backwards. So that previous nutritional history becomes important. Particularly if they've had live weight loss over that period, it can be a slow period to turn around, and it also affects their tissue stores of trace elements and their adequacy. So you have to be quite careful with that. And finally, there is a difference between steers and heifers clearly in their finishing weights and their propensity towards a fat finish. Heifers will usually finish at a lower weight, of course, and also earlier. And this is exacerbated by differences between British and European breeds. The British heifers on beet will often finish very quickly, and sometimes that can be used to advantage in these systems with a mix of heifers and steers, because as the heifers go out early, it leaves more feed for the European steers in particular to finish strongly on the same hectarage of beet. Now I'm going to turn it over to Marc Jones to talk on suckler cows. So Marc, over to you.
Okay, thanks Jim. So moving on to suckler cows, so I suppose in terms of requirements, it's very similar. So we're aiming for that 2.2% of body weight. So again, for your traditional smaller type cow, 650 kilos, that's 12 kilos of beet and 2 kilos of supplement. In terms of the transition, we'd want to treat them fairly similarly to the R2s on the finishing system. So we're aiming for that 1 kilo of dry matter starting at, with the aim of increasing it up every other day as we go through until they're up to that 12 kilos of fodder beet. Now, in terms of the supplement choice, we don't need to be quite as fussy with the suckler cows because we're not trying to push them quite as hard as we are with the younger stock or the finishing stock. So we could get away with just straw, hay, or poor quality silage because they simply just don't need that energy. All we're aiming to do is maintain or increase body condition score slightly above maintenance. So really, the general targets in terms of body condition score are a slight increase of probably 0.5 to 1 body condition score over that winter period. So generally they will tend to get a little bit heavier and carry a little bit more condition. In terms of protein, we're aiming for about 11 or 12%. So that's all we need, and that's adequate throughout the diet up till calving time. And then when we're actually looking at the utilisation levels, so Jim's also mentioned that with those photographs earlier, we're actually not looking for the same level of fodder beet to be left behind on the floor with the suckler cows, because again, we're not aiming to push them. So we're quite happy for these to clear up all the fodder beet underneath them before the next day's break, and then they're not going to get as fat as they possibly could do. And then, you know, I suppose looking at the British system or the UK systems, quite often we're looking to house for calving. So we'd probably pull them off about 2 weeks prior to this point, and then move them in and house them. Again, during that point, we could give them access to lifted fodder beet, just to give them that extra bit of energy. The other thing is, if we were looking to calve them outside, we could move them onto grass pasture about that 2 weeks before calving, just again to give them that time to settle in. And the other important point is we could again feed the fodder beet on the ground again to these cows to give them that extra energy to start with. So would you like to move the slide on one, Jim, for me? So moving on to beet at grass. So really what we'd like to do is to try and continue that transition back to grass. There's no reason why we can't give them 6 to 7 kilos of dry matter, or nearly half of their full allocation to fodder beet. Again, as mentioned before, this will boost the energy and the milk production to those calves for that first month. And really, the other important point is quite often a lot of farms are short of grass during that spring point, or we're looking to take silage. So again, by introducing fodder beet to grass at that kind of 50-50 level, we're aiming to maintain a much higher stocking rate during that period. And then in terms of the practicalities of feeding at grass, probably one of the simplest ways of doing it would be to try and budget weekly. So we'd aim to keep the cattle on daily shifts behind, again, hot wires and electric fences. But what we would aim to do is put most of that fodder beet out once a week and put it out in front of them for that 7-day period. So then you go along and just shift the cattle along on those daily shifts. So as mentioned, again, similar in terms of the transition period, but again, fairly simple in terms of those suckler cows. We're just looking to tick them over nicely during that winter period. We're not looking for that big growth or increase in fatness for calving time, and that's the most important part. So I'm just going to hand back over to Jim there.
Thank you, Mark. So we're going to finish here with just a very brief introduction of a couple of myths, and then we'll turn it over to question. So the usual myths that are available for consumption are around rumen acidosis, or sometimes it'll be expressed as subclinical acidosis. And there'll be talk and different discussion around how beet as a primary diet causes this or induces this. I want to be really clear, this was an area of our specific research for many years through the early part of the development of these systems, and this was published in the science literature quite a long time ago, that the maximum diet in beet, particularly where we're using really high intakes of beet with less than 10% in real terms of any other inputs, pasture in particular, is not associated with low rumen pHs in these beet systems. There's a lot to be said of this, and we don't have the time or the space to pursue it, but for various reasons, the rumen function in these animals is quite different, and the rumen pH is relatively high. It's higher than it is on ryegrass. So it's a good sign when people start talking about rumen acidosis in these well-transitioned, well-adjusted systems, that you should be careful of whatever else they say, because it's completely false. And typically what will happen after that is people will make recommendations, and those recommendations are usually the 3 that we've got there. That they'll say, well, rather than let them have unlimited beet, then you should restrict feed them. Actually, this is counterproductive. And what it does is it changes their intake pattern, because once they realise that they're restricted, they eat harder and faster. And if you want to induce rumen acidosis, the only way that you can do it in these beet systems is by restricting their intake. You change their intake pattern, you can actually force them into this. The other thing that's normally done is people would suggest, well, they have to have unrestricted supplement. They know how much they want to eat, and it's usually presented in some light like that. And that is disastrous for beef profit. As we've said before, if you look at the two things that really drive your profit, it is maximum unrestricted beet intake and very restricted supplement depending on the livestock class. The final one that you hear occasionally is that there's various rumen buffers that will make a difference to this. No, to put it bluntly with them, they won't. They don't make any difference at all, and they're not required. The rumen environment is really positive in these highly productive animals. Now, a couple of the others are that the myths you hear that you need very high protein supplements. Well, you don't. I think we've explained that with the different livestock classes. There's no great requirement, for example, soybean meal or cottonseed meal in these systems. As a general rule, they're not helpful and they're expensive. You don't recoup that cost. In the beef systems, there isn't a requirement to have calcium or phosphorus supplements. In the overwhelming bulk of cases, a very few soil regionally are so phosphorus deficient that there is something that's required, but it's relatively rare. As a general rule for the beef, it's never required. And the other couple are pretty straightforward. You hear a little bit that their very high soil intakes are a problem. Either they wear out their teeth or they tear out their teeth, or there's either rumen damage or intestinal damage from the soil moving through it, or it's associated with great outbreaks of disease. And in the UK case, that's often presented as listeriosis. This isn't the case, and it isn't true. And there's a very large number of animals in New Zealand every year that have been done for many years now, more than a decade. It's simply false. And the last two are, you hear occasionally still that the leaf has a particular toxin in it, oxalic acid or oxalates, very high in this, and so the leaf should be avoided. No, the leaf is an integral component of the grazing system. The actual level of oxalates in the mature plant is relatively low, and the rumens quickly adapt to break down that oxalate within the 14-day transition period anyway. And then the final one is something we addressed in a previous webinar, that you can transition by putting the animals on and off the crop for increasing periods of day. And the idea is that you're letting them eat a smaller and then larger amount over a period of time, and they will transition themselves onto it. This is highly, highly counterproductive in beef systems. It is commonly associated with feed aversion and low live weight gain. So we strongly recommend that you don't do that. So our summary checklist then we'll go through and turn over to questions. First and foremost, have I got my paddock selection and design giving me enough space, giving me access and allocation? Do I know what that crop yield is, and am I able to allocate it? Have we got the adequate vaccinations for 5-in-1 before they're going on the crop? Have we drenched these animals, and have we supplied their trace elements that are required? Are we sure that the system means that they've got the access that they require to both the beet and the supplement? For the transition, was it a well-designed transition that meant every day was a happy day and we got them onto high intakes without any perturbations? Are we sure that all of the group are eating, that some aren't being pushed out, or we've left them behind in transition, or we've wobbled them through that transition? And are we sure that we've got restricted supplements, but we've got unrestricted beet? Now with that, we'll turn it over to questions and go from there. So thank you, Mark.
Okay, thanks very much, Jim. So I suppose if anybody's got any questions, please pop them in the question section and send them through, and I'll start reading them out. So to start off, the first question is, are there any sites where beef finishing is not suitable? So what I thought I would do is give the first half of that question to Reese from Field Options. So in terms of the environmental side, and then I'll hand it back over to Jim just to talk about the possible reduction of intake. So Reese, if you could just mention, are there any sites where beef finishing is not suitable in terms of the environment?
Firstly, we need to grow a good crop of fodder beet. So fodder beet in itself is more suited to medium and lighter free draining soils. And of course, when it comes to grazing, we should really avoid any slopes and steep sites, really, just to avoid the pollution risk of soil runoff. And then the third point to think about is it needs to be a site that can be returned back into productivity once the fodder beet has been grazed.
Yes, well, I'd reiterate those points that Reese has made, and particularly from a grazing perspective, the deep, heavy soils are a disincentive. There's a saying that cattle don't like to be in the mud. They like to be out of the ground and not in the ground. So if there's very heavy, muddy environments, then what will happen is that they won't go and travel as frequently to the face to eat as they need to do. With beef, our productivity and profitability in these systems is really predicated on achieving these absolute maximum intakes. And if it's very boggy, they just won't do it. What they'll do is they'll wait for spring and they just end up eating enough to stay alive, and you don't make any money out of that in these systems. So site selection can be very important. Having said that, what constitutes a muddy environment is cultural as much as anything, and it isn't the reality that the animals have to be in a completely dry environment on a stony soil, for example, to achieve winter grazing. You can achieve that in a number of circumstances, but particularly for the young animals, you do have to have that paddock selection and site selection very careful. They won't tolerate deep mud that means that they have to walk at great effort over to the break. They'll just stay away from it and they'll lie down.
Okay. Next question coming in. What signs are there in the cattle if there's a bad transition?
Okay, it depends a little bit on the livestock class. I mean, if they're older cattle, so for the Suckler cows, for example, or the dairy cows in particular, then if the transition's handled very poorly, then what you see is clinical acidosis. It doesn't take very long at all to see cases of clinical acidosis. These animals will be, in the worst cases, they'll be on the ground or dead. And in other cases, they'll be very still. They're disinclined to move, zero appetite, often have a profuse diarrhea, and they rapidly degenerate in a short period of time. It's not as common in adult finishing stock to see clinical acidosis, and it's very uncommon to see clinical acidosis in the young stock. What you see instead in those cases is, if you look carefully, there'll be a fairly significant proportion of the group, so 25 or 30% of the group, that won't spend the time that they normally would on the beet crop. So they'll eat some of the leaf, but they won't eat a lot of the bulb, and it can be pretty obvious that they're not going forward. In the young animals in particular, you pick up your bad transition typically with your live weight gains at the end of the season. That's why we say over and over that transition is the most important 14 days. And if you get that transition wrong, you can't rescue the season. And what you'd find in those cases is that the live weight gains will show a smallish group, again, 25 or 30%, who have really good, proper live weight gains, and then a longish tail. And these animals will have suboptimal live weight gains going down to almost nothing. Now, those animals are feed aversion cases that you've wobbled them through that transition by teaching them not to eat a lot of beet. And they learn that lesson well, and you won't get them back that season. So it's very important to make sure that your transition is smooth.
Okay, good. So just a couple of questions coming in now. The first one, what is your advice on back fencing?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that question, Mark?
Yeah. What is your advice on back fencing?
Traditionally in these systems we haven't done so because, particularly in the beef systems, the way that the shelter was arranged was that the shelter was often at the early part of the paddock, so they maintained that shelter from the prevailing weather for most of the season. There are certain areas and regions that have made back fencing a requirement. This is on the basis of the idea that constant traverse across these soils will have some impact on the soils, which from a community point of view may result in more runoff. That's debatable whether or not that's actually true, but at least in a lot of environments and in a lot of flat areas, it probably isn't true. We don't automatically back fence, and unless you're quite careful with the paddock design, one effect of back fencing is that you really take away dry areas for them to lie on. If you're back fencing them 20, 30 metres behind that crop, and that's what they've already been across there, then you're putting them in a position where they can't go back to shelter and they haven't got anywhere dry to lie down. And for beef animals, that's probably more of a problem than it is in dairy cows. So there's no automatic advantage, in my opinion, in back fencing. Certainly, the overwhelming bulk of the systems that have been in use in New Zealand since my original development of these systems have not been back fenced, and we don't see any great changes in productivity before after it. The runoff in certain places can be a problem, and in those cases, back fencing does serve a purpose.
And then moving on to daily allocations. Are we better having a nice long line, or are we looking for more of a square shape?
It's really important not to use a square shape to answer that question bluntly, and it probably, I'd refer listeners back to the original webinar, which is the first one we did in this series, which was directly on transition. And we had spent some time in that explaining the difference between allocation and access. And as a blunt example of this, if we want to allocate 1 kilogram of dry matter, and we've got a 10-ton crop. Now that's, I'm just keeping the maths simple here. That would be very rare to get a 10-ton dry matter crop. But what it would mean is that there's 10,000 kilograms of dry matter in a 10,000 square metre hectare, or 1 kilogram of dry matter in every square metre. If I had 100 animals and I wanted to allocate them 1 kilogram each, I could potentially have a 10 by 10 metre square. But everybody intuitively would know that they wouldn't have access to that. I couldn't fit 100 animals in to eat that. Whereas I could take that same amount 100 metres wide by 1 metre deep, and I'll have full access for all the animals. So long faces of at least 1 linear metre are an absolutely critical component of highly productive beet systems. Squares just bluntly do not work. They result in higher leaf losses, so to a reduction in leaf utilisation, which often impacts on their total protein supply. So it's a very poor idea. You should go for wide faces with 1 metre of linear space per animal on that crop. Okay.
The next questions, in a very hard winter, we had the beast from the east probably 3 years ago. A lot of the tops were completely lost. Can we compensate for this with supplementation?
Well, there's 2 points to make on that one. The first one is, even in very, very hard winters, if the agronomy is appropriate, and as we mentioned earlier, there's a difference between sugar beet agronomy, which is what the UK has historically been used to, and grazing fodder beet system agronomy. And that is often in the use of fertiliser later and later in the season, and higher levels of nitrogen than most of the farmers would have been used to. Now, those higher levels of nitrogen have a couple of effects. They raise the nitrogen in the bulb dramatically in most cases. So there's a higher crude protein in the bulb, but it also has an effect on growing more leaf and keeping healthier leaf into that late autumn and winter. So in our most productive beef zones in New Zealand, in central Otago, it's very cold. So it's commonly 5, 10, and on occasion 15 Celsius below zero, and it can have snow events that last for some time, and it'll have constant frost events over that period. With appropriate agronomy, you can hold a lot more leaf into that system than people think. Where the leaf is genuinely lost is in autumn before the wet weather. Leaf that's frozen, for example, or even bitterly frozen, will sometimes, in the worst case scenario, turn brown and hang down off the plant, but it isn't lost to the plant in winter. It's blown off in drier autumn conditions when there's leaf disease and leaf loss, etc. So that's the first point I'd make, is that there's probably been a big shift in that. However, if for agronomic reasons, usually there isn't any leaf at all, because it won't be weather conditions that do that. I'll be blunt on that, it won't be. Then it's very, very difficult to supply what the leaf supplied in terms of supplement. However you supply that mineral, and particularly protein, to the system, you will almost always, with any of the roughage supplements, even Pasture, supply a lot more neutral detergent fibre to the total ration than what the leaf did. And as a consequence, you'll almost always have suboptimal intakes and live weight gain. So we work very hard to have a really leafy crop in front of those animals. And if that isn't the case, it can be difficult. Now, you have to work with the system that you've got. And in that circumstance, you would supply them with a high crude protein material. So something like good quality grass silage, or perhaps even loosened alfalfa silage. But it doesn't work the same as good leaf.
Okay. The next question, I think what it's trying to ask is that basically for weanling cattle, they were originally aiming to supplement with up to 2.5 kilos of dry matter of silage, and they've only got a certain amount of fodder beet. So is this going to ruin the plan for the winter, or will this reduce growth rates? What would be the problem with this in the end?
Well, if they are feeding to weaners and they're 300 kilograms or less, they're feeding 2.5 kilograms or allocating 2.5 kilograms of any silage, or even if it was reasonable quality pasture in the winter, then I could pretty much tell you the growth rates right now. They will likely do 400 or 500 grams a day. So you would cut your live weight gains in half using that system. Now, that might, in the first year, that might suit the farmer's system. Who knows what the goal was, and they would carry across that winter without any trouble. But if the system was, as we've described here, to use that winter as a production weapon and then have large-framed animals to make the most of the spring grass, then that's certainly not going to work. Feeding that amount of supplement will dramatically increase their beet intake, and it will dramatically decrease their total metabolizable energy intake for the day and their live weight gain. Now, it's not a harmful diet in the sense that they'd be happy and they'll eat it. You give it to them, you give that supplement to them, they'll eat it, and they'll be full and they'll go through and eat the rest of that beet, but it's not a productive diet. And you never achieve high live weight gains by feeding more supplement. You always reduce them.
Okay. And then I've just got one question next for Reese. So obviously there was a very wet winter last winter. What would have been the best way to remedy some of those soils which would have had a little bit more poaching and compaction?
Thank you, Mark. Well, it would have depended really on the depth of that poaching and compaction. First thing is to start with a spade and assess where that depth is lying at. If it's just in the top few inches, sort of 6-7 inches, well, that can be removed with deep ploughing, or otherwise it would be to get a subsoiler in if it's deeper. And it's often we see that a lot of these fields, they don't actually start to dry out until the soil's actually moved on top, really. So it'd be ploughing or sort of a deeper subsoiling.
Okay, good. Just one final question. Are there some animals which won't take to beet?
The short answer is very few. It's not uncommon for people who are introduced to beet grazing systems to say and to believe that there's a large number of the mob that aren't taking to beet. And again, that figure of 25 or 30% is a very common figure because it's what drops out the bottom if transition's poor or if access is poor to either the beet or the supplement. And in those cases, it's not difficult to generate that number of animals who are visibly doing reasonably poorly on the crop. Actually, in systems where access is set up well and where transition has been applied reasonably and sensibly, and therefore you get a smooth result, it's very uncommon to have more than 5% of the group who are to be removed. And 5% would be an extraordinary number to be removed from the older systems, and a relatively uncommon amount, even in well-organised weaner systems. But if you were to see it, you would likely see it in the weaners. They're the ones who are most fussy, and there is a tail that we work on in most cases that the tail will always be under 1%. So, you know, practically in mobs of 3,000 or so, we might be looking at something like 20 animals that are have some sort of issue that requires them to be removed. They're just doing poorly on it. And you don't see a large, at any stage, you really don't see a large number in well-managed systems, but you hear about it reasonably frequently. In almost all cases, it's been to do with their access and their transition.
Okay, good. So thank you very much, Jim, and thank you very much, Reese. That brings tonight's webinar to a close. So I thought, just as a quick reminder, we've got the dairy webinar, which will be next on, well, tomorrow evening on the 27th. We've got the sheep-specific one on the 2nd of November, and finally the agronomy one on the 9th of November. So again, thank you very much, Jim and Reese, and we hope to see you next time. Thank you very much.
Okay, goodbye.